The telegram arrived in Salt Lake City in a frozen January morning in 1871, and with it came the unraveling of the most elaborate deception in territorial Utah's history. 12 women, scattered across 12 different towns from Ogden to St. George, each believed herself to be the only Mrs. William Morrison. 12 homes, 12 wedding certificates, 12 sets of children who called him father. And not one of these women, not a single soul in any of those communities had the faintest notion that William Morrison was living 12 separate lives. When the truth finally emerged, it wouldn't be through confession or conscience, it would be through death. Because William Morrison's body was found in a boarding house in Sacramento, and when authorities searched his belongings, they discovered a leather journal that read like a railway schedule of matrimony. Monday in Provo, Wednesday in Fillmore, Saturday in Cedar City. The man had turned bigamy into a science and Utah Territory into his personal chessboard of deception. But here's what made this story truly haunt the territory for decades to come. When investigators finally tracked down all 12 wives, when they gathered these women together and showed them the evidence, something happened that nobody expected. Something that would raise questions about truth, identity, and the nature of love itself. Because you see, William Morrison wasn't who any of them thought he was. He wasn't even William Morrison. Welcome to the Whispered Histories, where we uncover the shocking true stories that history tried to bury. I'm your narrator, and today we're traveling back to 1870s Utah Territory, to a time when the West was still wild, when Mormon settlements dotted the landscape like islands in a desert sea, and when one man exploited the isolation of frontier life to construct a web of lies so intricate, so perfectly executed that it functioned flawlessly for nearly 8 years. If you're fascinated by stories of deception, mystery, and the darker corners of American history, please hit that like button and subscribe to the Whispered Histories. Because what you're about to hear is a story that newspapers of the era called the Mormon matrimonial mystery, though it had little to do with Mormon theology and everything to do with one man's sociopathic genius. This is a tale they didn't teach you in school, a forgotten chapter from the American frontier that raises questions we still can't fully answer today. To understand how William Morrison pulled off the impossible, you have to understand Utah Territory in 1870. This wasn't the Utah you know today. The Transcontinental Railroad had just been completed the year before, with the Golden Spick driven at Promontory Summit in May of 1869, but that single rail line did little to connect the scattered Mormon settlements that sprawled across the territory. From Salt Lake City, Mormon communities radiated outward like spokes on a wheel, separated by vast stretches of desert, mountain ranges that became impassable in winter, and distances that could take days or even weeks to traverse. These weren't suburbs connected by easy roads. These were isolated outposts where news traveled slowly, where a stranger's word was often all you had to go on, and where the social fabric was tight-knit within each community, but virtually non-existent between them. The population of Utah Territory in 1870 hovered around 86,000 souls, and the vast majority of them were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The practice of plural marriage, though controversial and increasingly under federal scrutiny, was still openly practiced by perhaps 20 to 30% of Mormon families.
This context created a peculiar social landscape. In these communities, a man having multiple wives wasn't shocking. What was shocking, what was absolutely unthinkable, Was a man having multiple wives who didn't know about each other. Mormon plural marriage, whatever one's opinion of it, operated on a principle of openness within the family unit. Wives knew about sister wives. The practice was acknowledged, however privately. But William Morrison wasn't practicing plural marriage. He was practicing something else entirely. He was living in parallel realities, and he'd figured out how to keep those realities from ever touching. The key was geography and timing. The key was understanding the rhythm of frontier life so perfectly that he could disappear from one town and appear in another without arousing suspicion. The key was becoming exactly who each community needed him to be. The man who would become William Morrison was born Thomas Albert Chandler in Burlington, Vermont. At least, that's what investigators would eventually piece together, though even this basic fact remained disputed. What we know for certain is that he arrived in Utah Territory sometime in 1863, during the height of the Civil War, when the territory was experiencing an influx of both Mormon converts and Gentile opportunists drawn by mining prospects and government contracts. He was 27 years old, handsome in that weathered frontier way, with dark hair that he kept meticulously groomed, a thick beard that he shaped carefully, and eyes that people later described as warm but somehow empty, like looking into a well-lit room with no one home. He stood about 5 feet 10 inches, well-built from physical labor, and he possessed something even more valuable than good looks. He possessed an uncanny ability to read people, to understand what they wanted, what they feared, and how to position himself as the answer to their unspoken prayers. In his early days in the territory, he worked as a freighter, hauling goods between settlements, and this is likely when he began to understand the geography of isolation that would later serve his purposes so well. He learned which towns were connected by regular traffic and which existed in relative solitude. He learned how long it took to travel between settlements in different seasons. He learned that a man could leave one community, be gone for weeks or even months, and return with any story he chose to tell about where he'd been. The West was big enough to swallow explanations whole. By 1865, he'd established himself in Provo under the name William Morrison, claiming to be a widower from Missouri whose wife had died on the trail west. He found work as a carpenter and general contractor, and he was good at it. People in Provo remembered him as hard-working, reliable, quiet but friendly. He attended church services regularly, donated to community causes, helped neighbors with repairs. He was by all accounts exactly the kind of solid, dependable man that a young woman in a frontier settlement might hope to marry. And in the spring of 1866, that's exactly what happened. Her name was Sarah Bennington, and she was 19 years old, the daughter of a farmer who'd come to Utah Territory in the first wave of Mormon migration. Sarah was everything a Victorian-era frontier bride was supposed to be: devout, hard-working, skilled in all the domestic arts that made survival in that harsh landscape. She could sew, cook, preserve food, tend a garden, and manage a household with the efficiency that frontier life demanded. She had soft brown hair that she wore in a simple bun, gentle eyes, and a quiet demeanor that masked a core of prairie steel.
Uncomfortable true stories from American history. The stories that don't fit neat categories. The stories that challenge our assumptions. The stories of people who lived through circumstances we can barely imagine and did things we struggle to judge. And next week, we'll be exploring another forgotten story from the 1870s, the tale of the all-female vigilante group that operated in Montana Territory, hunting down men who committed violence against women, operating entirely outside the law and sparking a debate about justice that continues to this day. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that episode.
Sarah Freeman's story reminds us that history is not made only by presidents and generals and famous people. It's made by individuals like her, people who survived impossible circumstances and left marks on the world, even if those marks are written in blood and shadow and questions without answers. And perhaps the most important thing we can learn from Sarah's story is that the people we turn into weapons, whether through slavery or trauma or systematic violence, don't stop being human, even when they do inhuman things. They remain people deserving of understanding, even when their actions defy easy justification. And that complexity, that uncomfortable recognition that victims can become perpetrators and still remain victims, that survival sometimes requires becoming monstrous, that the line between justice and revenge is drawn in individual conscience rather than legal code, is essential if we're going to understand not just Sarah Freeman's story, but our own history, our own capacity for violence, our own responsibility for the circumstances that create people like the Shadow, and our own obligation to build a world where children born into powerlessness have options beyond becoming killers in order to survive. Because Sarah Freeman, at 40, kills in Wyoming in 1879 is history, but the circumstances that created her, the violence that shaped her, and the choices she faced are not as far in the past as we might want to believe, and her shadow, like her name, still falls across us today.
And Hannah Carlson in Springville, 5 wives now, spread across central Utah like pins on a map. The distances between them ranged from 20 to 90 miles, just far enough that casual travel between communities was unlikely, just close enough that he could maintain his circuit. He'd spend 2 weeks in one town, move to the next, spend 2 weeks there, keep rotating. He claimed long-term projects that required his presence. He sent money when he couldn't be there in person. He wrote letters that were warm but vague about his exact locations. And always, he was the devoted husband when he was present. He remembered details about each wife's life. He brought thoughtful gifts. He was affectionate, attentive, present in the moment. Because he understood that the key to successful deception isn't just the lie, it's the truth that surrounds the lie. If everything else about him was genuine in each interaction, the structural lie of his parallel lives became invisible. The expansion continued with mathematical precision. By 1869, he had added 3 more wives, bringing his total to 8. These new marriages took him further afield, into settlements in the southern part of the territory. Rachel Morrison in Beaver, no relation, but she took his surname with pride. Abigail Foster in Parawan, a widow with 2 young children who thought she'd found security for her family. And Martha Jensen in Cedar City, the southern regional center, 250 miles from Salt Lake City. 8 wives. 8 separate lives, and the system showed no signs of breaking down. In fact, it was functioning so smoothly that Morrison grew bolder. In 1870, he married 4 more women in rapid succession, as if he'd finally perfected his method and could now scale it efficiently. Wife number 9 was Lydia Buchanan in Richfield, a remote settlement in Sevier County. Wife number 10 was Rebecca Sutton in Gunnison, even more isolated. Wife number 11 was Emma Caldwell in Lehigh, bringing him back closer to his original base of operations in Provo, a risky move that suggested either confidence or growing recklessness. And wife number 12 was Josephine Parker in Ogden, the territory's 2nd largest city after Salt Lake City, a railroad hub that might have seemed too connected, too busy, too dangerous for his scheme. But Morrison had been refining his craft for 5 years now. He knew how to compartmentalize. He knew that in a city like Ogden, anonymity could be an advantage. In smaller towns, everyone knew everyone else's business. In Ogden, you could be just another railroad contractor passing through, even if you passed through on a regular schedule. 12 wives,
12 homes, and by 1870, children were being born into this web of deception. Sarah and Provo had given birth to 2 children by then. Margaret and Fillmore had 1. Catherine and Nephi was pregnant with her first. These weren't just marriages anymore. These were families, separate family units that each believed themselves complete and whole, never knowing they were fragments of a larger, impossible pattern. The turning point came not from suspicion or investigation, or even from Morrison's own mistake, but from something he couldn't control, his own mortality. In late December 1870, William Morrison left Josephine in Ogden, telling her he had a major contract in California that would take several months but would pay exceptionally well. This was usual but not unprecedented. He'd occasionally taken longer jobs, and the promise of good money made sense. He traveled to Sacramento, checked into a boarding house under his usual name, and on January 3, 1871, he collapsed in his room. The boarding house keeper found him unconscious, called for a doctor, but William Morrison died 4 hours later.
The doctor's assessment was a massive stroke, sudden and catastrophic. He was only 34 years old, and nothing in his demeanor or behavior had suggested ill health. His death was random, senseless, the kind of tragedy that strikes without warning. And it should have been simple. A man dies far from home, his belongings are searched for next of kin information, a telegram is sent, a widow comes to claim the body and settle affairs. Except when the boarding house keeper went through Morrison's possessions to find contact information, he discovered something that made no sense. In Morrison's leather satchel, underneath his carpentry tools and work clothes, was a journal. Not a diary with personal thoughts and feelings, but something more disturbing. It was a ledger of sorts, a careful accounting of dates, locations, and names. 12 names, each written in Morrison's precise hand, each with a town beside it, each with dates marking what appeared to be a visiting schedule. Sarah, Provo, Margaret, Fillmore, Catherine, Nephi. The list continued, all 12 women, all 12 towns. Beside each name were notations, anniversaries, birthdays, children's names, and birth dates. It read like a railway timetable merged with a family registry, and even the boarding house keeper, a man who'd seen his share of frontier oddities, knew he was looking at something extraordinary. He contacted the local authorities in Sacramento, who examined the journal more carefully. What they found deepened the mystery. Morrison had meticulously tracked not just his schedule, but also his finances. He'd apparently been earning significant money from his carpentry work, and he'd been distributing it across all 12 households with careful equity. Each wife received money at regular intervals. Each household was provided for. The financial records suggested a man trying to be fair, trying to maintain 12 separate lives with equal attention and resources. It was bigamy on an industrial scale, but executed with almost tender care. Sacramento authorities sent a telegram to the U.S. Marshal's office in Salt Lake City, explaining what they'd found and requesting assistance in notifying next of kin. But which next of kin? All 12? The decision was made to begin an investigation before notifying any of the wives, to first understand the scope of what they were dealing with. A deputy marshal named James Hawthorne was assigned to the case, and he traveled to each of the 12 towns, speaking quietly with neighbors, checking county records, verifying marriages. What he discovered staggered him. Every single marriage was legal and properly recorded in the respective county offices. Morrison hadn't been haphazard or careless. Each marriage was performed by proper authority, each certificate filed correctly. In the eyes of the law, each marriage was legitimate, which meant that 11 of them were also bigamous crimes. But beyond the legal questions, Hawthorne discovered something more troubling. In every single town, William Morrison had been a model citizen. Neighbors praised him.
Church leaders spoke highly of him. His wives, when Hawthorne carefully questioned them without revealing his purpose, described him as a good husband, perhaps absent for work more than they would like, but always loving when present, always providing for his family, always faithful as far as they knew. There were no complaints, no suspicions, no warning signs. The man had successfully created 12 separate, functional, happy families, and he'd maintained them all simultaneously for years. Hawthorne's report to his superiors raised uncomfortable questions. This wasn't a case of a con man moving from town to town, leaving broken hearts and empty bank accounts. Morrison had stayed. He'd built real lives in each place. He'd honored his commitments as much as was humanly possible while living an impossible lie. Was this evil, or was this something else?
Something the law and society had no category for. The decision about how to handle the situation went all the way to the territorial governor, who consulted with federal authorities. The choice was made to notify all 12 wives simultaneously to prevent the news from spreading in uncontrolled ways, and to gather the women together, if they were willing, to help them understand the scope of what had happened. In February 1871, deputy marshals arrived in all 12 towns on the same day at approximately the same hour. The scene played out 12 times across Utah Territory, with minor variations, but the same essential shock. A knock on the door, a marshal with his hat in his hands, the terrible words, "Mrs. Morrison, I'm sorry to inform you that your husband has passed away." Then the pause, the expected grief, and then the words that shattered reality. "We need to speak with you about the circumstances of his death and about certain discoveries that were made regarding his affairs." In Provo, Sarah Morrison, now 24 years old with 2 small children, collapsed when the full truth was explained to her. In Fillmore, Margaret screamed that it was a lie, that her husband could never do such a thing. In Nephi, Catherine, heavily pregnant, went into premature labor from the shock and delivered a daughter 3 weeks early. The baby survived, but Catherine's faith in reality never fully recovered. Each woman reacted differently, but the patterns were similar. First came disbelief. Then came the verification, as marshals showed copies of the marriage certificates, the journal entries, the evidence that couldn't be denied. Then came the grief, but grief mixed with betrayal in ways that made it toxic and unbearable. They were mourning a husband who had never fully existed. They were mourning a marriage that was real to them, but was structurally a lie. They were mourning while simultaneously learning that every moment of happiness they'd experienced was built on deception. Some of the wives became hysterical. Some became silent, withdrawing into shock. Some became angry, raging against the dead man who couldn't answer their questions. And some, perhaps most disturbingly, became defensive. Because to accept that William Morrison had concealed them completely meant accepting that their judgment was fatally flawed, that they'd been fools, that their entire married life was a performance. It was easier for some to believe there must be an explanation, a misunderstanding, a context that would make this make sense. The territorial authorities made arrangements to bring all 12 wives to Salt Lake City in March 1871, to meet together, to see the evidence, to help each other process the impossible truth. Not all of them came. 2 refused outright, unable to face the others or unwilling to believe they were part of a group rather than the rightful widow. But 10 of the 12 wives made the journey to Salt Lake City and gathered in a meeting room at the territorial courthouse. Imagine that moment. 10 women, ranging in age from 20 to 30, each believing until recently that she was the sole Mrs. William Morrison, each now confronting living proof that her marriage was a lie. They sat in a circle, these women, who were both strangers and sister wives in the most twisted sense imaginable. Deputy Marshal Hawthorne laid out the evidence on a large table, the journal with its careful notations, copies of all 12 marriage certificates, photographs that Morrison had kept of some of his wives, financial records showing money distributed equally across all households, birth certificates of the children, 14 in total across the 12 marriages. The documentation was overwhelming, undeniable, and devastating. Then Hawthorne did something unexpected. He told them, despite the legal questions, despite the bigamy, he'd found no evidence that Morrison was cruel or deliberately harmful in the traditional sense.
The man apparently had been trying, in his twisted way, to be a good husband to all of them. He'd provided for them, he'd remembered details of their lives, he'd been affectionate and present when he was with them. According to the evidence, he'd even loved them, in whatever fractured way his psychology allowed. This revelation didn't comfort the wives. If anything, it made things worse. If Morrison had been a simple con man, stealing money or using them and leaving, they could hate him cleanly. But this was more complex. He'd built real relationships. He'd fathered children he seemed to care about. He'd created homes he returned to. What kind of person does that? What kind of love is real when it's divided into 12 pieces? The meeting devolved into chaos. Some wives wept, others argued, comparing their experiences, trying to figure out which marriage had been primary, which wife had been most important, as if winning some imaginary hierarchy would restore meaning to their shattered lives. Sarah, from Provo, insisted she'd been the first wife, which the records confirmed, so surely that meant something. Margaret from Fillmore argued that Morrison had spent the most time with her, that their connection had been deepest. Catherine from Nephi claimed he'd been most himself with her, most intellectually honest. And so it went, each woman trying to salvage something unique, something real from the wreckage. But the most disturbing moment came when Josephine from Ogden, the last wife, the Morrison had married most recently, spoke up. She was quiet, younger than most of the others, and she'd been silent through most of the meeting. Now she said something that silenced the room. What if he didn't lie to us? What if he told us the truth and we just didn't understand it? The other wives stared at her. What could she possibly mean? Josephine explained, her voice shaking. He told me once that he felt like he was living multiple lives, that he'd learned how to be exactly what each moment required, that he'd become a different man in each place he worked. I thought he was being poetic, talking about adapting to different jobs and towns. But what if he was being literal? What if he really did become different people, and he honestly believed each version of himself was complete and whole? This suggestion opened a crack in the foundation of their understanding. Was William Morrison a calculating sociopath who'd engineered this deception with cold precision? Or was he something else, someone who'd perhaps dissociated into multiple selves, each genuine in its own context? The journal suggested careful planning, but the testimony from each town suggested genuine emotion and connection. Could both be true? Marshal Hawthorne admitted he didn't know. The investigation had revealed the facts, but not the psychology behind them. And the truth was, they'd never know. Morrison was dead, his motivations buried with him. The wives were left with evidence, but no explanation, with facts, but no meaning. Over the following weeks, as news of the case spread throughout Utah Territory and then to newspapers across the nation, the Mormon matrimonial mystery became a sensation, though, as mentioned, it had nothing to do with Mormon plural marriage. Eastern newspapers used it to attack Mormon culture anyway, conveniently ignoring that Morrison's crimes were crimes because he'd hidden his marriages, the opposite of Mormon practice. In Utah, the case caused soul-searching. How had 12 communities failed to notice? How had the isolation of frontier life enabled such a massive deception? What did it say about the territory's social fabric that a man could maintain this charade for 8 years? The legal aftermath was complicated and messy. Because Morrison was dead, there could be no criminal prosecution for bigamy. The question became, which marriage was legally valid? Technically, only the first one, Sarah's, back in Provo. But Morrison had died in California, not in Utah, which complicated jurisdiction. And his estate, as such it was, had to be divided. Morrison had saved carefully over the years, and his total assets, including tools, a small amount of property, and cash, amounted to about $3,000, significant money in 1871. The territorial court made a Solomon's choice. The estate would be divided 14 ways, 1 share for each wife and 1 for each child. Sarah, as the legal wife, would receive nothing extra. The judge reasoned that Morrison had apparently tried to treat all his families equally in life, so the law would honor that intention in death. It was an unprecedented ruling that satisfied no one, but perhaps as fair as possible in an impossible situation. But money wasn't what the wives needed. They needed answers, understanding, closure. They needed to know if their marriages were real, if the man they'd loved existed, if the years they'd spent as his wife meant anything.
And these questions had no legal answers. Some of the wives remained in their communities, resuming their lives as widows, though the scandal made normal social interaction difficult. Some remarried, though they carried the stigma of having been one of Morrison's duped wives. Some moved away, seeking fresh starts where their history wouldn't follow them. The children grew up knowing their father had been the infamous William Morrison, the man with 12 wives, and that knowledge shaped their identities in ways both obvious and subtle. But there was one more twist to this story, one final mystery that emerged months after Morrison's death and was never fully resolved. In June 1871, a woman appeared in Salt Lake City, claiming to be Morrison's sister, traveling from Vermont. She said her brother's real name had been Thomas Albert Chandler, and she'd come to claim his remains and bring them back east for burial. The authorities were skeptical, but she had documentation: a family Bible with Thomas's birth recorded, childhood letters, a photograph of a young man who did resemble Morrison, though the beard and years made certain identification difficult. The woman, who gave her name as Clara Chandler Whittemore, told a story that added yet another layer to the mystery. According to Clara, Thomas had been a normal boy from a respectable Vermont family until the age of 15, when he'd suffered a severe head injury in a farming accident. He'd fallen from a barn loft and struck his head on a plow blade. He'd been unconscious for 3 days, and when he awoke, he was different. Not obviously so at first, but his family noticed changes. He became secretive. He became skilled at telling people what they wanted to hear. He started living what Clara called separate lives, being one person at home, another at school, another with friends, carefully keeping the different versions of himself from overlapping. By the time he was 20, the family had largely written him off as a charming but unreliable young man who couldn't hold a job or maintain real relationships. He'd left Vermont in 1856, and the family had heard from him only sporadically over the years. The last letter had come from somewhere in Utah Territory in 1867, saying he was doing well and had married singular. Clara had brought that letter with her, and the handwriting matched samples of Morrison's writing from the journal. If Clara's story was true,
It suggested that Morrison's behavior might have had a neurological basis, that the head injury had damaged something in his brain that governed identity and truth-telling. It would explain the peculiar nature of his deception, how he could seem genuinely loving in each relationship while maintaining the structural lie. It would suggest not evil, but damage, a broken mind trying to function in ways that seemed normal from the inside, but created chaos from the outside. But was Clara's story true? Marshall Hawthorne investigated as best he could through correspondence with Vermont authorities. They confirmed a Chandler family in Burlington, confirmed a son named Thomas who'd left the area years before, but couldn't verify the head injury story or definitively connect Thomas Chandler to William Morrison. The photographic resemblance was suggestive, but not conclusive. Clara herself seemed genuine, her grief appeared real, but in an era before reliable identification systems, before fingerprints or DNA, certainty was impossible. The territorial authorities ultimately released Morrison's body to Clara, who had it cremated and claimed to take the ashes back to Vermont. Whether she actually did so, whether she really was her sister, whether Thomas Chandler and William Morrison were the same person, all remained uncertain, and that uncertainty haunted everyone involved. Because if Morrison had been brain damaged, if his behavior stemmed from injury rather than choice, did that change the moral calculus? Were his wives victims of a crime or casualties of a medical condition? Could someone be both perpetrator and victim simultaneously?
The 12 wives, or the 10 who'd met together, never reached consensus on these questions. In the years that followed, a few of them maintained occasional correspondence, forming a strange sisterhood born of shared trauma. Most cut all contact, wanting to forget the entire episode. But none of them ever forgot William Morrison, or whatever his real name was, because he'd been real to each of them, even if the context was a lie. The love they'd felt had been genuine, even if its object was fundamentally fraudulent. And that contradiction, that impossible coexistence of real emotion and false foundation, was something they carried for the rest of their lives. The children of these marriages, those 14 children born into Morrison's web of deception, had their own reckoning to make. As they grew older, they had to decide what their father's story meant for their own identities. Some rejected the Morrison name entirely, taking their mother's maiden names or stepmother's surnames when their mothers remarried. Some embraced the notoriety, using it as a strange source of distinction. And some spent their lives trying to understand their father, reading and rereading the journal that the court eventually made public, searching for clues to the man behind the deception. That journal still exists, held in the Utah State Archives, and it remains one of the most disturbing documents in the territory's history. Not because it's violent or explicitly cruel, but because it's so careful, so organized, so apparently loving in its detailed attention to each wife and child. Morrison had tracked anniversaries and birthdays with the precision of a devoted husband. He'd noted each child's milestones, first words and first steps. He recorded little details, Sarah's favorite flowers, Margaret's fear of thunderstorms, Catherine's love of books. The journal reads like it was written by 12 different devoted husbands, except it was written by one man who was somehow all of them simultaneously. Modern psychologists who've examined the journal and the case records have offered various theories. Some suggest dissociative identity disorder, though Morrison's compartmentalization was too organized and controlled for classic DID. Some propose antisocial personality disorder, though Morrison showed empathy and consistent caregiving unusual for sociopaths. Some theorize a unique form of narcissistic personality disorder, where Morrison's sense of self was so fragmented that he could genuinely believe in the reality of each separate life while maintaining them. But the truth is, William Morrison, or Thomas Chandler, or whoever he really was, remains fundamentally inexplicable. His story doesn't fit our narratives about con men, or bigamists, or deceptive husbands. He's too caring to be simply evil, too successful for too long to be simply crazy, too consistent in his deception to be merely opportunistic. He created and maintained 12 separate functional families in an era when communication and travel made such a feat nearly impossible, and he did it for years without being caught, without making obvious mistakes, without apparently suffering the psychological strain that should have made such compartmentalization unbearable. And when the truth finally emerged, it emerged only because of his death, not because of any flaw in his system. If he hadn't had that stroke in Sacramento, if he'd lived another decade or two, would he have eventually added more wives? Would he have maintained his circuit indefinitely?
Or was there some limit, some point at which even he would have recognized the impossibility of what he was doing and stopped? We'll never know. What we do know is that his legacy rippled through Utah territory and beyond in unexpected ways. The case prompted discussions about marriage law, about identity verification, about the need for better communication between communities. It contributed to arguments for civil registration of marriages rather than just religious ceremonies. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and the importance of social connectivity. But beyond these practical impacts, the story of William Morrison and his 12 wives became a legend, a ghost story of sorts that parents in Utah territory told to illustrate the dangers of deception. The tale took on folkloric qualities over the years, with details exaggerated or changed. In some versions, Morrison was a monster who'd murdered his wives. In others, he was a romantic figure, a man who loved too much and too broadly. Neither version was accurate, but both reflected deep anxieties about identity, truth, and the nature of love in a society that was still forming its values and structures. The wives themselves largely disappeared from public record after the initial scandal. Most lived into old age, their later years unmarked by any particular drama. A few gave interviews to historians in the early 20th century when the case was ancient history and the sting of scandal had faded. These interviews reveal women who'd come to terms with their past in various ways. Sarah, the first wife, apparently never remarried and spent her life quietly in Provo, raising her children and refusing to speak about Morrison, except to say he'd been a good father to her children, whatever else he might have been. Margaret from Fillmore remarried within 3 years and lived a conventional life, her Morrison marriage rarely mentioned. Catherine from Nephi, the schoolteacher, wrote a memoir in the 1890s that included a chapter on her marriage to Morrison, describing it as a formative experience in understanding the gap between appearance and reality, a lesson that informed her teaching for decades. But perhaps the most poignant testimony came from Josephine, the youngest and last wife, who was interviewed in 1923 when she was 72 years old. The interviewer asked if she'd ever understood why Morrison did what he did, and her answer was both simple and profound. "I think he was trying to be everything to everyone, and he almost succeeded. He failed not because he was evil, but because he was human, and humans can't be infinite. But for a while, for those years he maintained it, I think he achieved something impossible, something miraculous in its way, even if it was also terrible. He made 12 women feel completely loved, 12 families feel complete. The fact that it was built on lies doesn't erase the reality of how it felt, and I'm not sure if that makes it better or worse."
This ambiguity, this refusal to fit the story into a simple moral framework, is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire case. We want our villains to be clearly villainous, our victims to be clearly innocent, our stories to have moral lessons that are easy to extract and apply. But the story of William Morrison resists these simplifications. He was a bigamist, a liar, a man who violated the law and social norms in spectacular fashion. But he was also apparently a loving husband and father who provided for his families, who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who came home to each wife with affection and attention. He was a criminal who seemed to cause no harm until he was discovered, at which point the revelation of his crimes caused enormous pain, not the crimes themselves. If he'd never been caught, if he died quietly in one of his 12 homes instead of dying in a Sacramento boarding house, would anyone have been harmed? His wives would have mourned him as beloved husbands, never knowing they'd shared him.
Resent. Only Morrison himself would have known the truth, and he carried that truth to his grave without apparently being crushed by it. This raises uncomfortable questions about truth and happiness. If the lie creates genuine happiness, does the eventual revelation of the lie retroactively destroy that happiness, or was the happiness real in its moment? Morrison's wives thought they'd had good marriages until they learned the truth. Did the truth change the past, or only the future? These are philosophical questions without clear answers, and they're part of why the Morrison case continues to fascinate people more than 150 years later. In recent decades, with the advent of DNA testing and genealogical research, some of Morrison's descendants have connected with each other, discovering distant cousins they never knew existed. These meetings have been described as surreal, bringing together people who share a grandfather or great-grandfather, but whose family histories diverged completely from the moment of Morrison's death. Some of these descendants have worked together to create a more complete picture of Morrison's life, pooling family stories and documents. Through this research, a few additional details have emerged. Morrison apparently spoke multiple languages fluently, which may have helped him adopt different personas in different communities. He was skilled not just at carpentry, but at several trades, making him valuable and mobile. He had an eidetic memory, which would have been crucial for keeping his various lives straight without written notes that might be discovered. And he apparently never drank alcohol, maintaining the kind of absolute clarity and control that his lifestyle required. But for every detail that's been confirmed, mysteries remain. Was he really Thomas Chandler from Vermont? What happened in his life before he came to Utah that prepared him for this extraordinary deception? Did he ever have moments of doubt or crisis, or did he genuinely believe in the sustainability of his system? What would he have said if confronted alive? How would he have explained or justified his actions? We'll never know these answers, and perhaps that's fitting. The story of William Morrison and his 12 wives is fundamentally a story about unknowability, about the gaps between public presentation and private reality, about the impossibility of ever fully knowing another person. He exploited those gaps with genius-level skill, but in doing so, he also demonstrated their existence to everyone who examined his case. We think we know our spouses, our neighbors, our community members, but we know only what they show us, and what they show us is always a constructed version, a presentation crafted for our perception. Morrison's only difference was of degree, not of kind. His masks were more elaborate, his compartments more rigid, his deception more extreme. But in the end, Aren't we all living slightly different lives in different contexts, presenting different versions of ourselves to family, friends, employers, strangers? Morrison simply took this universal human behavior to its logical and terrifying extreme. The story of William Morrison and his 12 wives reminds us that the line between normalcy and madness, between acceptable social performance and unforgivable deception, between love and manipulation, is thinner than we'd like to believe. It reminds us that frontier isolation created opportunities for both authentic community and spectacular fraud. It reminds us that love is both more resilient and more fragile than we think, that it can survive incredible betrayal while being destroyed by simple truth. And ultimately, it reminds us that the human capacity for compartmentalization, for living in multiple realities simultaneously, is far greater than we usually acknowledge. William Morrison's 12 wives lived out the rest of their lives in the shadow of this story, each processing it in her own way, each finding or failing to find peace with what had happened. The children grew up bearing their father's legacy, some with pride, some with shame, most with confusion. The communities where Morrison had lived slowly forgot the details, though the general story persisted as folklore. And Morrison himself, or Chandler, or whoever he truly was, passed into history as a cautionary tale, a psychological puzzle, a ghost that haunted Utah's territorial past. His grave, if Clara really took his ashes to Vermont, has never been located. No marker exists to identify his final resting place.
In a way, this is appropriate for a man who lived without a fixed identity, who was many men to many people, who left behind questions instead of answers. The mystery of William Morrison isn't really about how he maintained 12 marriages, though that's impressive enough. The mystery is about why. What drove a man to create and sustain such an elaborate architecture of deception? What satisfaction did it provide that a normal life could not? Was it about the challenge, the thrill of never being caught? Was it about some fractured psychology that required multiple identities to feel whole? Was it about a desperate need to be loved that was so profound it had to be satisfied 12 times over? Or was it something else entirely, something we lack the concepts to understand? These questions have echoed through the decades since Morrison's death, asked by historians, psychologists, descendants, and anyone who encounters this strange story from America's frontier past. Thank you for watching this episode of the Whispered Histories. The story of William Morrison and his 12 wives is one that challenges our understanding of deception, love, and identity. It's a story that history largely forgot, buried in territorial archives and faded newspaper clippings, but it raises questions that remain urgently relevant today. In our modern world of social media and digital surveillance, Morrison's feat would be impossible, but the psychology that drove him, the human capacity for compartmentalization and self-deception, that remains very much alive. If this story haunted you, if it made you question the nature of truth and relationships, if it left you with more questions than answers, please like this video and subscribe to the Whispered Histories for more forgotten tales from America's darkest past. We uncover the stories that history tried to bury, the ones that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and American society. Hit the notification bell to be alerted when we post our next episode, which will take you into the world of 1880s Chicago and a murder that was committed in front of 100 witnesses, none of whom agreed on what they'd seen. Until then, remember that history's greatest mysteries often hide in plain sight, in the gaps between what people show us and who they really are. The 12 wives of William Morrison learned this truth the hardest way possible, and their story stands as a testament to the fact that the most shocking deceptions aren't the ones that hide in shadows, but the ones that function perfectly in daylight until the day they don't. Sleep well, and we'll see you in the next Whispered History.